Imagine the year is 1850. You are in the middle of the Atlantic, trapped on a floating wooden fortress. Around you are 300 men, exhausted, smelling of salt and sweat, fighting off scurvy and the constant fear of the abyss. But at the very back of the ship, behind a heavy guarded oak door, lies a different world entirely. Here, the air smells of expensive tobacco and old books. There are silk curtains, fine porcelain, and a mahogany desk bolted to the floor. This is the captain's cabin. To the crew, it was a palace of mystery. To the captain, it was a golden cage. Was it a place of absolute luxury or a prison of crushing loneliness? Today, we are opening that door to reveal the hidden life of the man in charge. The god of the ship who lived in splendor while his men suffered, yet carried a burden that would break most humans. Welcome to the captain's cabin. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of the high seas, make sure to subscribe to Bilge Beyond and hit the bell icon. We journey into the deepest corners of history every week, and you won't want to miss our next voyage. Let's start where every captain's day started and ended, the room itself. Walk to the very stern of a 19th century ship, past the wheel, past the marine standing guard with his musket, and you'll find a heavy door that no ordinary sailor was permitted to knock on without reason. Open it, and the ship seems to disappear. This is the stern gallery, and it was, quite literally, the only room on board with a view. Picture a wall of glass panes curving gently with the shape of the hull, salt-streaked but polished, catching the last light of the day. Some of the larger vessels of the era even had a small walkway just outside those windows, a narrow balcony called the quarter gallery, where a captain could step out in private and simply watch the horizon without a single other soul in sight. This was the one place on the entire vessel where a man could watch the ship's wake stretch out behind him instead of staring at another man's back in the dark. For the 300 men crammed below decks, there were no windows at all. For the captain, there was an entire wall of them, and sometimes a door leading outside to more. That contrast alone tells you everything about naval hierarchy in one glance. Inside, the room was built for a strange kind of comfort with a purpose. A cot, often slung from the ceiling on ropes or set on gimbals, swayed gently with the roll of the ship, so that even in a rising sea, the captain's sleep was undisturbed while the rest of the crew were thrown against their hammocks and each other. Along one wall sat a modest private library. Navigation manuals, a Bible, perhaps a worn volume of poetry or a captured merchant's account books, kept less for pleasure than for the long, empty hours of an ocean crossing when there was nothing to do but wait for wind or weather to change. Tucked into a locked cupboard was the so-called wine locker, a small stock of spirits, preserved fruit, and delicacies that marked the difference between the captain's table and the crew's daily ration of hardtack and salted meat, crawling with weevils. This same room doubled as something else entirely on formal evenings. The great cabin, where the captain hosted his senior officers for dinner. China plates, a folding table extended to its full length, watered-down wine poured with genuine ceremony. For an hour or two, rank softened just slightly, though never disappeared completely. A lieutenant did not forget who he was dining with, no matter how good the claret was. Now contrast that with the other end of the ship. Forward, beneath the bow, sat the forecastle, short for forecastle, where the ordinary seaman slept. This was a cramped, low-ceilinged space where men slung their hammocks 18 inches apart, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same damp, salt-heavy air night after night. There was no privacy, no dry corner, no light, but a single swinging lantern kept low for fear of fire. Sickness spread fast in a space like that. Scurvy, dysentery, and fever moved through the forecastle the way rumor moved through the rest of the ship, quickly and impossible to stop once it started. Water came in through seams in the bow with every wave the ship met head-on, so the forward berths were often the wettest on the entire vessel, occupied by the men with the least say in anything. And because so few of the crew ever actually saw inside that room, it became exactly what the hook promised you, a palace of mystery. Sailors who never once crossed that threshold in years of service still had firm opinions about what lay behind it. Rumors passed from watch to watch, that the captain kept a chest of gold beneath his cot, that he never slept at all, that he'd made some private bargain with fortune itself to keep the ship afloat through storms that should have sunk it. None of that had to be true to matter. On a wooden ship, uncertainty about the one man who held total power over your life was its own kind of weather system. and the closed door of that cabin generated as much superstition among the crew as any storm on the horizon. In between these two extremes sat the officers' wardroom, a kind of middle ground where lieutenants and warrant officers messed together, sharing better food than the crew, but nowhere near the privacy of the captain's own quarters. It's a useful reminder that a ship wasn't really divided into two classes, but into a whole ladder of them, each rung marked by how much space, light, and quiet a man was allowed to call his own. Rank on a wooden ship was measured almost as much in square footage and window glass as it was in the stripes on a uniform. So you had two worlds stitched together by the same keel. Aft, mahogany, glass and quiet. Forward, damp canvas, rope, and the constant noise of other men's bodies. And the strange thing is, neither man, captain or common sailor, could really escape his side of that divide. The gallery windows that gave the captain his privacy also sealed him away from every ordinary human comfort his crew still had. Company, gossip, the simple noise of belonging to a group. The architecture of the ship was the architecture of command itself, built in wood and glass long before anyone wrote it into a rule book. Naval tradition had a name for what the captain became the moment he took command: a social ghost. He was present everywhere. His authority touched every rope, every ration, every flogging, but he himself was almost never seen up close. He did not eat with the crew. He rarely gambled or joked with his own officers as an equal. He almost never spoke to an ordinary seaman directly at all, and when he did, it was an event the whole deck would talk about for days afterward. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was survival, dressed up as etiquette. Doctrine of the age insisted that familiarity bred contempt, and contempt on a ship of 300 armed, exhausted, frightened men could tip into something far worse than contempt. A captain who laughed too easily with his crew risked being seen as weak the moment he had to give an order that might get some of those same men killed. So the cabin door stayed closed, meals stayed formal, and the distance was deliberate, practiced, and rehearsed almost like a performance. Think about what that isolation actually cost a man psychologically. He couldn't form real friendships aboard his own ship. Every relationship carried a hidden asterisk. This man might have to be sent aloft into a gale tomorrow, might have to be flogged for insubordination next week, might have to be ordered into the guns of an enemy frigate before the month was out. Genuine closeness made all of that unbearable, so captains learned, often at great personal cost, to keep everyone at arm's length. Many written accounts from the era describe men in command who hadn't had an unguarded conversation in months, sometimes years. Men who kept a formal, correct distance even from their own first officer. The cabin gave them privacy from the crew. It also quietly gave them privacy from any form of comfort at all. History gives us a sharp reminder of what happens when that fragile arrangement collapses. The 1789 mutiny aboard the Bounty, when a young lieutenant named Fletcher Christian led a rebellion against his captain in the South Pacific, is remembered today as high adventure. But at its heart, it was exactly this social contract breaking down. A crew deciding, rightly or wrongly, that the isolation of command had curdled into something they could no longer trust. Every captain of the era knew that story, or one like it, and every closed cabin door carried a little of that fear behind it. And then there was the title itself, Master Under God. That phrase wasn't decoration. On the high seas, hundreds of miles from any court, any church, any law but the one he carried in his own head, the captain effectively was the final authority on earth for the men under him. He could order a flogging, order a court-martial, decide who ate and who didn't when supplies ran short, decide whether to fight or flee when a strange sail appeared on the horizon. The crew's mixture of reverence and fear toward that closed cabin door came from knowing exactly how much power lived behind it, and how little recourse they had if that power ever turned against them. And the isolation cut both ways, because the captain wasn't actually the final word he appeared to be from the deck. Behind him stood an admiralty, a chain of command on land that could, and did, summon him home to answer for every decision made in that cabin. A court-martial wasn't just a threat hanging over the crew, it hung over the captain just as heavily. Losing a ship, however unavoidably, meant a formal inquiry as a matter of routine. The captain who couldn't account for his choices in that lonely logbook risked losing not just his command, but his entire career and reputation in a single hearing. So even his authority, absolute as it looked from the forecastle, was really just a temporary loan from men he might never meet, sitting in offices thousands of miles from the nearest wave. There was even a ritual built to manage the loneliness without ever naming it directly. Naval tradition of the era included a formal toast, repeated at dinner on a fixed rotation of nights, to absent wives and sweethearts, to fallen comrades, to the king or the ship itself. Small, scripted moments of sentiment that let officers acknowledge what they were missing without ever having to say it plainly in their own words. It was emotion filtered through ceremony, which was often the only way emotion was allowed to surface at all in a world built entirely around discipline and distance. Quick question for you before we move on. Could you survive 6 months at sea without a single person to call a friend? Not a workmate you nod to in passing, not a familiar face, an actual friend you could be completely honest with. Drop your honest answer in the comments below, because for the man behind that cabin door, that wasn't a hypothetical. It was Tuesday. Step past the cot and the wine locker, and you reached the part of the cabin that actually justified all that privilege, the desk. This was not a bedroom with some paperwork on the side. This was the operational brain of the entire vessel, and everything the ship did, it did because of calculations made at that one bolted-down table, usually late at night, by lantern light, while everyone else slept. Spread across it on any given evening, you might find a sextant, its brass arm catching lamplight as the captain measured the angle of a star or the midday sun against the horizon to fix the ship's latitude. Beside it, if the ship was well equipped, sat a marine chronometer, a precision instrument descended from the work of clockmaker John Harrison, whose lifelong pursuit of an accurate seagoing timepiece finally solved one of the greatest problems in the history of navigation: how to know your longitude, your east-west position, when there was nothing around you but open water. A chronometer was so expensive and so essential that losing one at sea was treated almost like losing a cannon. Before it, working out longitude relied on dead reckoning, estimating speed, heading, and time elapsed, and hoping the accumulated guesswork hadn't drifted the ship dangerously off course. Rolled charts, some official, some hand-annotated with a previous captain's notes on currents, hazards, and safe anchorages, covered whatever space the instruments didn't. But the desk's most important cargo wasn't brass or glass at all, it was paper. Every evening, without fail, the captain sat down and wrote in the ship's log the weather, the heading, the speed, any incident worth recording, any disciplinary action taken, any decision that might later need defending in front of an admiralty board back on shore. This wasn't a diary. It was a legal document, and the discipline of writing it every single day, storm or calm, exhaustion or clarity, was one of the loneliest and most consistent rituals of command. Alongside it sat other ledgers, the muster book tracking every man aboard, the punishment book recording every flogging and its cause, sometimes a surgeon's report on the health of the crew. Together, these papers were the closest thing the ship had to a memory of itself. Orders themselves rarely traveled straight from that desk to a sailor's ear. A captain worked mostly through his lieutenants, issuing instructions that moved down through the officers, then the petty officers, before ever reaching the men actually hauling a line or trimming a sail. Signal flags did similar work between ships in a fleet, letting a single flagship's cabin coordinate the movements of a dozen vessels without a single voice being raised. It meant the captain's presence could be felt everywhere on the ship and across an entire fleet, without him ever having to leave that room at all. Command by paper, flag, and a chain of trusted subordinates rather than by direct shouted orders. The pressure of getting any of this wrong was enormous, and history is full of captains whose careers, and sometimes lives, ended because of a single miscalculated position. A ship that missed its landfall by even a few miles could run straight onto a reef in the dark, and there was rarely a second chance to correct that kind of mistake once the lookout's shout of breakers ahead came too late. This is part of why the desk in that cabin held instruments worth more than most sailors would earn in a decade. The cost of the equipment was nothing compared to the cost of being wrong. And here's the detail that tells you how seriously that logbook was taken. If the ship was ever at real risk of capture, the log was one of the very first things the captain had to deal with. Either secure it so it survived, or destroy it so it never fell into an enemy's hands. A logbook in the wrong hands could reveal a fleet's positions, a nation's trade routes, or evidence that would hang a man back on shore. So picture this scene for a moment. A captain, cannon fire rattling the stern windows, deciding in seconds whether to save his own written record of the voyage or throw it into the sea weighted with lead shot to keep it from an enemy boarding party. That is what the brain of the ship actually meant in practice, a room where information itself had to be protected like ammunition, because in the wrong hands, ink and paper could be as dangerous as gunpowder. Every part of that cabin we've described so far, the glass, the desk, the private library, assumes that the crew respects the door. But command at sea in this era rested on a fragile and constantly tested agreement, and every captain knew that agreement could break. That's why, tucked near the head of the bed in many cabins of the period, sat something the crew rarely saw and almost never touched: the arms chest. A small, iron-strapped chest holding pistols, a cutlass or two, and enough powder and shot to make a very determined last stand if it ever came to that, if a mutiny actually broke out, and history is full of them, from single-ship uprisings that never made it into any history book to full-scale rebellions still remembered centuries later. The stern of the ship was designed, whether by accident of tradition or deliberate foresight, to be defensible. The cabin sat behind a heavy door, often reinforced, with a narrow approach that made it hard for more than one or two men to rush it at once. Marines, when carried aboard, were typically berthed between the officers' quarters and the crew's own living space for exactly this reason: a human buffer between the men who gave the orders and the men who might one day refuse to follow them. A captain who could reach that arm's chest, bar the door, and hold that narrow approach had bought himself time, even if the rest of the ship had already turned against him. It was, in the truest sense, a fortress built quietly into what looked, from the outside, like a comfortable home. It's also worth noting how rare it was for anyone besides the captain, and occasionally his most senior officers, to be granted real access to that room at all. On the handful of voyages where a captain's wife was permitted aboard, uncommon, but documented in various fleets of the era, she lived essentially inside that isolation with him, one of the only people on the entire ship who saw the man behind the authority day after day. For every other captain, there was no such companionship, only the arms chest, the charts, and whatever he'd brought from home to remind him of a life beyond the ship's rail. The stakes of getting this wrong were absolute. Naval law of the period treated mutiny as one of the gravest crimes a sailor could commit, punishable by hanging, and the men who led rebellions at sea knew exactly what awaited them if they were caught. That knowledge cut both ways. It deterred plenty of would-be mutineers, but it also meant that once a rebellion actually started, there was no path back to ordinary discipline. Everyone involved had already crossed a line that could only end in a court-martial or a fight to the death. That tension shaped what a man chose to keep close to him in that room. Alongside the charts and the pistols, you'd often find the few personal artifacts that made a wooden box at the edge of the world feel survivable. A miniature portrait of a wife or a child back on shore, a pressed and dried flower carried from a garden he might never see again, sometimes a small instrument, a flute, a fiddle, a set of pipes, that let him make some sound in that room that wasn't the creak of timber or the distant shout of the night watch. These weren't luxuries in the decorative sense. They were, for many captains, the only thread connecting the isolated authority of command to the ordinary human being underneath it. It's worth sitting with that image for a second. A man surrounded by weapons meant to defend his own life from his own crew, and 2 feet away on the same shelf, a dried flower he's kept for years because it reminds him he was once someone's son or someone's husband before he became master under God. There's a quieter kind of defense worth mentioning too, one that had nothing to do with pistols. A captain who ran a fair ship, who fed his men properly when supplies allowed, who didn't flog without cause, rarely needed the arms chest at all. The strongest fortress any captain had wasn't behind that reinforced door. It was the loyalty he'd managed to earn from men who had every reason and every opportunity to take that ship away from him if they'd wanted to. The chest was insurance. Trust was the actual policy. By the middle of the 19th century, the world the wooden captain's cabin belonged to was already beginning to disappear. Steam replaced sail. Iron and steel replaced timber and rope. Coal smoke replaced the smell of tar and salt air. The stern gallery, with its curved glass and swaying cot, gave way over the following decades to steel bulkheads, electric lighting, and a bridge built for speed, engine telegraphs, and efficiency rather than isolation and quiet reflection. The romance of the golden-lit cabin at sunset didn't survive the transition well. An efficient steamship line running fixed schedules across the Atlantic didn't need a private library or a wine locker built into the captain's quarters, and a steamship captain's day tied to engine reports and coal consumption looked very different from the long contemplative hours a sailing captain once spent bent silently over a chart, waiting for wind that might not come for days. If you strip away everything we've covered today and just picture a single ordinary day in that cabin, it looked something like this. Dawn. A report from the night watch delivered through the door rather than a face-to-face conversation. Mid-morning, an hour with the sextant and the charts, checking yesterday's position against today's. Midday, the formal ritual of dinner, correct and distant, even with his own officers. Afternoon, the log, the punishment book, letters that might never reach anyone before the ship did. Evening, the desk again, alone, going over tomorrow's decisions with no one to talk them through with except the paper in front of him. Repeat that, with small variations for months, sometimes years, and you start to understand why loneliness is really the only accurate word for what that gilded room actually was. But what that cabin represented never really left command. Strip away the mahogany and the sextants, and you're left with the same trade that every captain in every era and every kind of vessel has had to accept: absolute power in exchange for absolute isolation. The authority to decide who lives, who dies, which course to sail, which risk to take, bought and paid for with the price of never truly being known by the people whose lives depend on that decision. That trade didn't need sails or wooden hulls to exist. It only needed one person willing, or forced, to carry it. Museums today do their best to preserve what's left of that world. Restored vessels let visitors walk through a reconstructed great cabin and stand at a captain's desk, and it's genuinely strange how small most of these rooms turn out to be in person, smaller than people expect, smaller than the movies ever show them. It's easy to forget that the loneliest room in naval history wasn't loud or grand. It was quiet, damp at the edges, and just big enough for one man and the weight he carried alone. So the next time you see an old ship, in a museum, in a painting, or in a film, don't just look at the masts and the sails. Look for those windows at the very back of the vessel, and imagine the man sitting there alone at day's end, staring out at the wake stretching behind him, carrying the lives of hundreds of men on his shoulders with no one in the world he could tell how heavy that weight really was.